Hello and a very warm welcome to our first episode in the webinar series, the Canada-India Dialogue. I'm Maha Siddiqui. Canada and India hit a reset last year when Prime Minister Narendra Modi traveled to Kananaskis for the G7 summit. And last week, Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada visited India, ushering in a fresh phase of pragmatic engagement between the two countries. 5 MOUs were signed, a declaration of intent, a commercial contract, and a framework for CEPA negotiations, which is the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. The foundation of this new phase of partnership between India and Canada is laid on trade and economics. So let's examine the outcome and the outlook of the engagement and the ties between India and Canada. Let me welcome our guests, Dammu Ravi, former Indian diplomat who served as the Secretary Economic Relations in the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and Professor Yves Tiberghien, Distinguished Fellow, Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and Director Emeritus, Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. He also was part of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy that was devised in 2022. Let me start with you, Professor Yves, because I know you need to leave early today. It's clear that one of the main drivers of this relationship is economic consideration. But the question is how much and how fast can specifically Canada pivot to newer partners? Realistically, how much can Canada move away from the United States, its largest trading partner, and divert trade to Indo-Pacific or specifically India?
Thank you, Maha, for the great question and the discussion with an esteemed colleague here at a critical time. I'll start by saying that what just happened between Canada and India is big. It's very, very big. In fact, it would have been unthinkable even a year ago. Just looking at the joint statement with 61 items across the entire gamut for domestic national security, all the way to, of course, the economy, environment, marine issues, critical minerals, etc., energy, massive in energy agenda. It's huge. So it's a complete breakthrough. Or they call it a reset. And I guess the biggest moment in decades in Canada-India relations. So that's a big moment. The economy part is a chunk of it, but is not the full picture. There's a lot of course, security dimension and this whole Indo-Pacific rebalancing. I mean, it also fulfills the initial plan, 3-4 years ago in the Indo-Pacific strategy of Canada, which were stopped or frozen with respect to India for a number of years. So now when it comes to the economy, it is true and trade. It is true that Canada is deeply embedded with the US economy. This is the result of geography and economic gravity. Also choices made by Canadian and US governments over decades, going back to the 1930s, actually, after the Great Depression, that they were mutually better off in a way, integrating supply chains, mutually supporting each other, etc. And Canadian governments across all parties have kept reinforcing this partnership, which was more and more institutionalized through NAFTA, etc. And so it's what's happening now with President Trump is again historic. It's unbelievable almost for Canadians, right? They're completely shocked, especially when it comes together with a sovereignty threat, right? And so, well, the reality of 80 years of integration is such that 77% of export from Canada went to the US in 2024. Now, by the end of last year, 2025, that number is down 10 points to 67%. But trade is also down. In general, I mean, apparently there's about $70 billion of exports that were wiped out from Canada to the US. And in turn, a bit of increase, about 30 billion. So some of it is a loss of exports. So that's where there is a shock on the economy. But there's been a bit of rebalancing spread across 30 new countries that have risen. India is one of them, but just about $1 billion increase last year of exports from Canada. China was bigger at 5-6 billion, and then Japan, Korea, etc. So the reality is tough for Canada. And that's why the Prime Minister is trying to do something extraordinary. I mean, we have never had such um, in a way, such an intense effort at resetting all global relationship and extremely rapid, high speed, high intensity effort to open, new partnerships and very high level relationships with key countries around the world. This is probably the most impactful and, in a way, thoughtful Prime Minister Canada has ever had at a moment of a great reset. And the Canada-India massive reset is one chunk of this whole moment. Hmm.
All right. Let me
Hmm.
go across to Damu Ravi now because
Hmm.
you have rightly mentioned it's being done at great speed at the moment. Damu Ravi, both sides have been of the opinion that the current bilateral trade between the two countries has been much below potential. Now, if they want to improve their ties based on economics and trade, what would both sides need to do for what they are saying a five-fold expansion in trade by 2030?
Well, thank you, Maha Siddiqui, for this opportunity. And also, it's a great honor to be in the same panel with Professor Yves Tiberghien. And also for the participants, India and Canada both together. Well, I think let me touch the most important part of the relationship. I know in today's world, the relationship between India and Canada is multifaceted. It has grown very significantly. But in one sense, I think the trade underpins that relationship. And we have to recognize that economic partnerships have become increasingly important for many countries in the world that are looking into the future with a lot of positivity. But in the specific case of India and Canada, the visit has, it's as Professor Yves has said, that it is a reset of the relationship after 3 years of into the shadows. Now it has come out of that, and now it is looking forward to a much more vibrant future for the two relationship. So let's look at the bilateral trade. I think in the sense of the goods, it's about uh, 11-12 billion dollars. India is exporting 8 billion. Canada is exporting to India about 5.3 billion. But services complementing the two together is going up to 25 to 30 billion dollars. But the point is, they have an ambitious target of $50 billion in the goods trade alone by 2030, which is, in my view, very, very ambitious. But it's important to have big ambition and work towards it and get the energies together. What does one do? First of all, what I recognize in the relationship trade is the complementarity nature of the two. So there is no competition in terms of what we import and what we export. So a lot of that comes from Canada is actually what we need. So look at the pulses, the lentils. The India has a huge market, and we need to get that from outside to be able to stabilize our own prices. For food security of India, Canada can be a very important partner. But we need to have a lot more structured forecast in terms of what we need to import so that there is a certainty for trade in that line. Look at again coal and oil, which is again a large item, the energy products that come from Canada, which are very important for India's energy security. So are the fertilizers and a few things that come from Canada. So in that sense, there are complementarities in our trade. I think what the visit has really brought into focus is the need to further expand it through the free trade agreement, that is the SEPA. The two sides have agreed to enter into SEPA, and I think they have even gone ahead to have the terms of reference concluded at the time of the visit, and then they've agreed to fast track it by end of the year to be able to do this ambitious SEPA. In my view, that will open up even more uh, avenues for trade between the two countries because the tariffs will go down. We have the experience now. We have done ambitious trade with India EU and India UK. Of course, in the past few years with Australia, we've done, UAE, we've done. So that has created space to be able to do another ambitious deal with Canada in SEPA. I think if both sides put the energies together, we should be able to achieve this target. It's not impossible. But another element to it, which is driving it. People say that, the geopolitics, geoeconomics of it today it's become even more imperative for both sides to diversify the markets. And that should be a strategic. India is a huge market, notwithstanding the distances, but I think there is a huge market and opportunity for Canadian businesses. So it's for India. You need economic cooperation partnership from Canada in terms of technology, finances that will flow. Already we know that a lot of these pension funds and the Canadian funds which come to India, it's crossed over $100 billion in cumulative figures. That's a very, very significant for our own driving manufacturing and growth in the country. So I think at times we are seeing a more disturbed geopolitical situation. These kind of partnerships are very important, not just for the two countries, but also to signal that around the world that the need for diversification and realignment is important.
Absolutely. In fact, I'll go to specific sectors that have been mentioned and touched upon by Dammu Ravi. But before that, Professor Yves, I just want to ask you this question about what advantages does Canada believe India holds vis-a-vis other options that it's also exploring? I mean, Canada is also looking at a possible deal with China. It's Prime Minister Carney along with India, also visited Australia, going to Japan. So, what are the advantages that Canada believes or you believe India might have vis-a-vis other jurisdictions that Canada is looking at the moment?
Yeah, thank you for the great question. And I fully agree with every word that Dammu Ravi has said. So, in a sense, Canada is turning Indian. Canada is turning to multi-alignment. And is learning that, a one-stop dependence on a giant neighbor is extremely dangerous. And so we are learning this. And you could see it's fascinating how so Carney has done trips to Europe, to of course the Middle East, etc., like UAE. Then he did this foray into China, unlocking that relationship, partly out of realism. He said, "We are dealing with the world, not the world we wish to have, but the world as it is." And in order to quickly score a little bit of reduction in the dependence on the US, China is a necessary component of that. But then in this new trip, which is India, Australia, Japan, is counterbalancing this with a lot of talk on economic security and safe energy flows and Indo security and all this with more trusted partners in terms of you know they are already themselves Quad. Canada wants to be in the Quad, so there's a whole connection here. And in that bigger picture, India is not just like every other, a middle power. It's a rising superpower. It's after US and China, this is the big country. This is the rising giant. It's becoming already central in everything. And so Canada, pursuing this principle pragmatism, which is advocated by our Prime Minister, clearly has put a lot of focus on India as an indispensable partner. And the beauty of India, of course, there was some political obstacles to overcome, and I think they're doing it with hard work and actually a lot of thoughtfulness. Then India combines the long-term economic potential with all the potential on the security dialogue and some balancing in a way. So it's like when you do intervention in financial markets, you then want to neutralize it. And in some ways, opening with India helps cope with some potential side effects of any opening with China, but on its own is also seen as an absolutely essential piece of the global chessboard now and a very, very important partner. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Dammu Ravi, it's interesting how Professor Yves has mentioned India as a rising power, Canada as a middle power at the moment. Can these two together shape the way the supply chain is at the moment? Because that is really critical for both the countries. And it's not just a realization that we've had at the moment. We've known this since COVID hit the world.
I think let me approach this from a very broad perspective here. In terms of, let's say, the way things have changed in the 21st century in particular, what used to be, we used to think that the trade is essentially moving a finished product from across the borders, but that has changed so much. Now it is actually components which dominate the world trade. So supply chains become very important. For a very long time, the world was only thinking that finished goods going across borders, but it's actually the supply chains which drive the world trade. So now, how do we ensure that these supply chains remain very stable and predictable? That's important for trade, for the global trade. Now, we are at a stage where today these supply chain disruptions have taken place. One is the geopolitical tensions that you have seen various hotspots around the world that is creating that. The second is also the unilateral tariffs. The unilateral tariffs of the United States is also created a huge disruption to the supply chains. Now, when such a things happen, immediately you see countries traditionally which were exporting and traditional partners, their relationship also get affected. For a world trade as such, the MFN-based principle of the GATT Article 1, which is the most favored nation treatment, that every country gives the same kind of offers to each other, that principle is also disrupted. So it's going to be it's a very, very chaotic thing, and that you are seeing a different kind of a situation of disruption. But what does this disruption do? I think from the point of view of trading partners, it will suffer. The manufacturing in a country where it is exporting will suffer, which for a developing country point of view is a huge job losses, retrenchments will happen. And from the point of view of the traditional partners, it is again, tariffs goes up, the purchasing power will not chase the tariff, so the demand will come down. The demand will come down would also mean that trade in terms of around the world will come down. Now, how does one adjust to this? Realignments will take time because you have to suddenly meet the standards and regulatory frameworks in other countries. The preferences of the consumers will have to also you have to cater to. So, in the sense that India and Canada will have to work towards creating resilient supply chains, because you have to be clear that what we import from Canada has a predictability. And that can only come through you have an instrument of FTA that gives that assurance. And the same thing, what India exports to Canada should not have any disruption, but that can, you have pharma, you have traditionally textiles, leather, these and engineering products that usually India exports to that part of the world also have to have a predictability and transparency, and so that you're able to get. And in my view, if Canada and India are able to come to that understanding, it will set around the world a new understanding, the middle powers coming together, and that can enhance. So one motivates the other. India Canada's deal can motivate India and European Union coming together, which has already happened. And so the middle countries are able to create a more stable supply chains that is able to take the global trade in a more predictable manner. And it will also help the global south in the larger context.
Thank you. Let me now
Maha, can
come
I add
around.
something? Can I add
Sure,
something
sure,
to this?
Professor. Yes,
Um,
Professor Yves, go
it's
ahead.
such a great point on the growing systemic role of middle powers, especially when they move in the same direction. So I'll start by making a shameless plug with my co-author Zaki Laidi. This last week, I just have a new book out from Cambridge Elements called The Hedgers: How the Global South Navigates US-China Rivalry. And he's focusing on eight very, very important countries, India being the first. We call India the hedger in chief. But we look at how the global South middle powers, and so there are those like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Gulf
Mm.
countries, Brazil, South Africa, following India, um, how they increasingly have found autonomy in navigating between the two great powers. And as the two great powers try to make a bipolar world, the global South major powers or super middle powers, in a sense, are working very hard to multipolarize that bipolarization and make sure it doesn't get bipolarized. And as they act with increasing agency through multi-alignment strategies, they actually have had already systemic impact on both geopolitics and geoeconomics. And now a country like Canada is learning that we are in a very fast-moving, uncertain, and complex world. This is the word that both Prime Ministers Modi and Carney used actually in their declaration. It's very, very important to work with the global South, middle powers, and rising powers like India, and that this group of countries actually has a lot more agency than is often given in realism in international relations. They are not anymore rule takers. Now they're rule makers if they can move in a certain direction on certain, agreements and certain directions. Mhm. Mhm.
Absolutely. I mean, at least that's what it appears to be at the moment, considering that middle power countries have found a voice and they are voicing their concerns very openly. Professor Tiberghien, I want to get into sector specific questions now. And I want to start with the most important one between the two sides, energy and critical minerals. Now, how do you see Canada overcoming some of the internal domestic hurdles in being able to supply to India what it's promising?
Who would you like first to answer?
I would like you to go first.
Oh, okay, good. So I'm smiling because Maha knows the inside stories, having spent time in Canada. So it is true that Canada, on one hand, Canada claims to be this super energy, critical mineral superpower. And it's true, the reserves are immense and probably even beyond what we know because the territory is so big. But it's also true that delivering those to markets has been slower than hoped for a long time. Because while there's geography, a lot of them are not just right on the coast, and we have lots of mountains, and you have to get them to the coast to export them. And then you run into issues of democratic acceptability and indigenous questions and so on. Also, we have simply lacked capital. Canada's lacked the capital to develop and export those resources up at scale. Um, and so, well, for oil and certain things, it was always easier to bring them down to the US for refining. So oil, all the pipelines go south. And LNG, anyway, LNG is quite new for Canada, so we didn't have all the infrastructure. So that's been the issue. And so what Canada is trying to do now is to bootstrap all this, to accelerate the massive investment, infrastructure investment needed. And there's three parts to that strategy. The first part is massive internal investment. So there have been changes in the legal arrangements to allow to fast track 10 national priority projects with massive federal investment. And that's new, both in the scale of investment and the fast tracking to override obstacles at provincial level, actually also environmental bottlenecks and all. So we're trying to, Canada is trying to undo some of the regulatory obstacles that were put over decades. So that's the first piece. The second piece is this time not to just rely on American investment and become completely dependent. And so the third piece becomes go around the world and in a way promise all those resources and at the same time bring investment from a lot of partners. So especially start with countries like Japan, Korea, but I think they must be part of the discussion with India as well. And then it's across the board, energy, critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, uranium is already quite developed, much easier. And so all this, basically it's a massive, massive effort at bootstrapping this export at the same time at developing new relationships with key countries like India. So yes, it's not tomorrow, but it could be faster than the record of recent years. Mm. Mm.
Dammu, Ravi, what do you see India seeking from this strategic energy partnership that the two sides spoke about in the joint statement?
So let me add to the critical minerals part what the Professor Yves has mentioned. I think I quite agree with what he said, but I think in the broad aspect of it, we have to understand that in this world of critical minerals, which is so important for the 21st century technologies, the critical minerals underpin that, the magnets that come from. But today we are seeing that domination of the supply chains of critical minerals in one part of the region or one country is increasingly a big risk for all the countries around the world. And that's where both India and Canada, I think this visit has made us to rethink on this, de-risking how important it is for all of us, and to ensure that the supply chains are spread out. It is not concentrated in one place. And Canada, from that point of view, is extremely an important partner. It has, as Professor mentioned, there are huge reserves of it. India can tap it. India is a huge market. We need all of that. So partnerships, both bilateral level and also multilateral level. I think in a plurilateral sense, Canada, Japan, Korea can chip in as well. I think even at the plurilateral agreement, the mineral security partnership is also important. We have to explore where we can get this going. And this is recognizing that this is so important. In the energy sector, I think Canada is again, in my view, for India, an important energy partner, security partner. Why? Because, in the backdrop of what's going on around today, in the geopolitical sense, there is a disruption. The Hormuz Straits, that nearly one-fourth of the world or one-fifth of the world oil and gas that comes from that part of the world is going to be disrupted for a long time to come, because reconstruction will take time where the installations in the current existence are affected. So what Canada has that India really looks for, which we are already importing energy products like coal, oil that come from there. But I think beyond that, Canada is even more important from the way the India's energy matrix is shaping. I think there was a talk during the visit about nuclear energy that support from Canada in terms of supply of uranium. There was already a deal signed for a continuous supply of that. And also in terms of LNG, LPG, again, Canada has huge reserves. Put together, I think I heard Prime Minister saying they have for 100 years. So that's a kind of reserves that they hold in the energy space, which is an important for India, because energy growth is equally important as much as energy development for India. So all this, when I see in a triangular aspect of that, Canada can be an important partner. Look at the renewables part. I think during the visit, there was a signing on Canada has come on to the solar alliances, International Solar Alliance. It has also become part of the biofuel alliances. And it is also agreed to cooperate with India in the green hydrogen space. So, in India, the energy matrix is shaping in the way we really wanted it in some, let's say, renewable space. 500 gigawatts is our target. And a lot of it, I believe, the partnership of India and Canada can drive it. As we go to rooftop and we go to solar projects and parks everywhere, bioethanol again is such an important area. Canada has the technologies, and as much as it has even funding part of it, the Canadian pension funds that can come to support these initiatives in the country can create a big opportunity for the energy security of the country in future.
Professor Yves, I'm just curious to know over here, much of the energy, I mean, obviously it is spread out across Canada, but Alberta is a very important province in Canada as far as energy is concerned. And there are voices from Alberta. We have seen recently where one of the groups that wants to separate from Canada, were going and meeting the Trump administration as well. How does how does Canada overcome these issues as well, if it really wants to be that one country that is supplying energy at this critical time?
Yeah, thank you for the sharp question again, Maha. So for viewers, it's important to know that Canada is quite special with energy. That is, the control of energy resource is at the level of provinces, not the federal level. So it's quite rare that such an important piece of economic policy is actually controlled by provinces. That also creates strange incentives. That is, if there is massive exports, say in oil that is from Alberta, Alberta would get the windfall. And however, it has to be transported through BC land, including indigenous land and BC waters, where risks are present, but the revenues will be very limited for BC. So they create a bit of a zero-sum game, political economy here between the two provinces. So that's the first thing to know. The second thing is, Alberta has really, over the decades, developed its own culture, and it has been an increasing cultural war. I mean, it also reverberates the reality of, blue state versus red states in the U.S., right? We are penetrated by media from the U.S. and so on. So, Alberta is often called the Texas of Canada, and there's a very, very strong, conservative, religious, proud culture of autonomy. And the rift with the Trudeau government was really rising. It was across the board. Of course, the Trudeau government was stopping, was putting down the oil economy and blocking any further pipeline after authorizing one. So there's a political economy fight, but there was a growing cultural fight. And so that fueled the sentiments toward autonomy or even independence among some Albertans. Never became the majority, and of course, there was also intervention from the US. There was funding flows coming out of the US. There was the MAGA movement playing on this. So there's also interference, right? And Prime Minister Carney has been aware of this from day one. As Canada's sovereignty is under threat with the talk of the 51st state, clearly the Alberta rift became a vulnerability, and so that's partly why Prime Minister Carney first had been very thoughtful in working with all provincial leaders, including those from other parties than his, very thoughtfully, and he has earned the trust of many. And then with Alberta, he was really focused on lowering the pressure, lowering the cultural war. And he has reset, by the way, all the discourse of the government more to the center. So there's no more extremely, progressive cultural discourse from the Prime Minister. Very pragmatic, very hands-on. We're under threat. We face major uncertainties. Time to focus on the country. And then second, he has authorized, or he has moved fast on working on potential, even a new pipeline for oil, which is more controversial because oil, of course, it's not like LNG. It has much more impact on climate change. There's a lot of opposition that remains, especially in BC. And so, but he's trying to do this in order to lower the tension with Alberta. And he had some success. I think it has decreased the acuteness of the crisis. Again, we have a very thoughtful prime minister who understands the stakes of what's happening now. Mm.
Professor Eve, I know you have to leave, so Dammu Ravi, if you just give me 2 more minutes with Professor Eve to give a like a wrapping statement, Professor Eve, on one concern that could emanate from countries, even India. What if there is a change in sentiment from the United States? Does Canada go back to its original partnerships, or has the relationship completely changed? As Prime Minister Mark Carney has said on the face of it, that the relationship with the US will never be the same again. But do we read it at face value?
Yeah, another great question. So it's true that if there was a different government, the pressure could go down, and the urgency, because now there's a sense of threat, right? And in fact, in opinion polls, majority of Canadians, more than 50%, now name the US as the number one threat to Canada, not China anymore, not even Russia. So there's something really fundamental that happened. But what, when you have cooked the rice, it's hard to uncook it. That's my presence in Taiwan, right? So the reality is now every Canadian citizen and government will have to worry about, even if you have a nice government coming back, what happens 4 years later. In a way, the genie has been out of the bottle, and everyone has realized that the complete dependence of Canada on the US is a structural danger. So that reality is very deep, and I don't think it can be reversed. No, the intensity can be lowered or increased. Now it's extremely high speed. The speed could go down, but I think that realization is a fundamental change. Let me add one more thing with respect to India, because there has been discussion in policy circles for years now of how critical that relationship for Canada with India was. But then there was this political obstacle. and is rooted in diaspora politics and the reality of the human diaspora. But something again here is fundamentally changing. What I had heard from interviewing both Indian officials, academics, students, and Canadians, I could see there was a psychological rift as well. There was lack of trust in working together to work through those issues. The issues are difficult and sensitive, but it's even worse if the officials don't even talk and don't trust each other. And what I noticed here, ever since Foreign Minister Anand went in the fall and started this security dialogue, now we have national security advisors talking and so on. There's really an effort at really resetting the human relation and really showing mutual respect. So I know the Indian side always thought, whatever the practical issue, what happened, there is no respect. There is no respect for the Indian dignity, no understanding, of the post-colonial reality. I think there's a huge effort on the Canadian side to really understand the Indian perspective and then to work in a pragmatic way through cooperation and mutual respect. Mm.
Professor Yves, many thanks for joining us on this discussion today. We'll let you go there. Thank you for joining us and hope to see you again.
Thank you, Maha, and thank you, Dammu, Ravi. It's really an honor being with you on this panel. And I forgot to mention the book is free download for 4 more days on the Cambridge Elements page if you Google the Hedges.
Okay, I'll get one copy. Okay, noted. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure and honor. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Dammu, Ravi, I want to come back to you. This is a question on building on what Professor Yves said, the question of trust. How important is that currency when the two countries are looking at improving trade and economic ties?
Yeah. So, no, Maha, it's a very good question and very thought-provoking, I must say. But see, what happens to build trust between nations, it takes a lot of time. It's almost decadal, in the effort of the two countries, people-to-people contact, the officials, and then it slowly. But to break it doesn't take much time. It can just go down like a house of bricks, collapsing in a quicksand. So the importance, again, resetting the relationship, you have to construct that same building, brick by brick. It's not a house of cards, but it's a really brick concrete. So there's a lot of effort. We have to take forward the relationship. But I think the focus is right. The focus has now become very strongly economic cooperation, which will underpin the relationship and the various dimensions of it. So I will touch upon what Professor has talked about. The number one threat of Canada today is the United States. So much has changed so suddenly, where the whole region, in the North American region, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, so interlinked and so closely, but that is broken because there's no trust in that relationship. Again, it's a lesson for all of us. We have been conditioned to think that within the region, the intra-trade will determine the relationship, that will cement the relationship. But today is not so. So which is why we have to be more strategic in the way we think. Interests of the nation will determine how you position yourself on the global stage and with whom you will develop the relationship. But I think what it tells us is today is the dependencies can be weaponized. And that's a very dangerous thing in the international relationship and relations among the countries. So knowing that, and this is a lesson for all, that you need to diversify, strategically think into the future, that how you diversify, and be very careful. Don't put all eggs in one basket, but keep diversifying and keep looking at new partnerships. So I see from that point of view, India, Canada coming together one is diversification, and the second is complementarities, and the third is the market sizes are huge in the country, in India, and then the Canadians' pension funds and funds that are coming and technology is going to be complementary. So that's going to drive the economic relationship, and it has many: trade, investment, to energy, to critical minerals, to agriculture. There's so many facets there in the relationship, which will, in my view, find a very strong footing and will grow from there, and the businesses will benefit out of that. Now, specifically, and again, I like to see that it's just not India and Canada. It's bilaterally, yes. But I think at the multilateral level, there is an important role that both countries can play to set an example for the countries around the world who are also facing the similar challenges today, both geopolitically and geoeconomically, and the global south coming together. Because we need to ultimately have the world as one, because we are so interconnectedly dependent on each other. And this relationship is very magnetic. You have to have that thing growing.
You mentioned one sector, which is agriculture. Again, one that has been mentioned by the two sides. Now, Canada has some elements which will be useful to India in the context of agri-tech. But core agriculture, Dammu, Ravi, we have seen in the past has been a stumbling block sometimes in trade engagements or trade deals. Do you see India and Canada having complementarities that will not lead to that sort of a situation for the two?
So, Maha, again, a great question from you. I mean, agriculture, in my view, again, I'll come from first touch the broad aspects of it. It's a very sensitive subject. In any country, agriculture is very sensitive because no country want to go to another country with a begging ball in terms of crisis and to say give it. And we've seen this during the COVID time, that how vulnerable the countries that did not invest in their own agriculture and food security, how vulnerable they became, that they had to line up to ask for food from another country. India, of course, has surplus. We are totally a self-reliant country in terms of agriculture products. And it's, again, thanks to Green Revolution and the great minds that worked for the food security of the country. Now we are self-sufficient. But at the same time, there is a fundamental difference in the way Canada approaches and the way we approaches. We have about 120 million small and marginal farmers. Okay. And of that, about 100 are really vulnerable with very small land holdings. Canada has a more mechanized and huge agriculture farms they have. That challenge they don't have. And in India, this is a very, very sensitive subject because small holdings will not give a better yield and will not be able to create that kind of a scope to be able to secure enough for their own livelihood. So they're constantly under pressure, and this is again a very sensitive subject in the country, both politically and economically. Now, how do we see this? Going forward, we have to be creative in how we approach this subject because 1.4 billion people, if you have to feed from out of your own country, it's not a right thing to do because you're going to deplete your water resources sooner or later. We have to understand that our future and our children should also have the benefit of a good environment, self-sufficiency, and good water. Now, we cannot deplete this. So today, notwithstanding that we are so much concerned about agriculture product in the country, self-sufficiency, but we still import. Pulses, lentils are coming from elsewhere, and Canada is one of the largest suppliers for India. So is other countries like Australia, where we import from. But it also tells us that the demand is so high that the domestic production is not able to meet that demand. So we will continue to depend on countries like Canada for that. But as I said, there has to be certainty and clarity in how much we can allow to import from Canada so that the businesses are able to plan that year ahead or 2 years ahead. So that is where the FTA will come into the picture to be able to create the clarity. And I will take this one step forward. I think increasingly the technology that Canada has in agriculture and agro businesses, all that will be useful because we haven't come to that stage yet. The food processing sector, there's a huge opportunity, and that sector is fully opened up. It is not that they have to grow everything, that we have to import everything. I think the next level of value addition in the agriculture is actually food processing. And that's where, again, is a huge opportunity for Canadian businesses to come into India, set up food processing centers in the country, and take advantage of the 100% equity that allows today, and huge concessions in that space. I think that requires some imagination and more creativity on both sides. And how do we unleash that potential for the benefit of both sides and taking advantage of the huge market that we have in India?
I quickly want to touch on the IT sector as well. Canada, the IT sector.
The IT.
Information technology, yes. So there is a lot of conversation in Canada about opening up a separate H-1B stream because of what we have seen in the US. So there is nothing concrete at the moment, but the ministers have been talking about it and making statements. Do you see that as one mobility issue that should be factored in when CEPA negotiations start? Because mobility, as we are increasingly seeing, is becoming very politicized internationally, with the issue of immigrants becoming very sensitive for some of these countries, and also in Canada.
Yeah, so Maha, again, very important question that our participants should know this, but let me approach it from a very broad perspective first. See, what we have seen in the last 100 years or so, particularly in the technology space that's moving so fast, is that technology will chase talent. So wherever in the world, countries that have focused on technology of the future, they will attract talent. There's no way that you can stop the talent coming from outside and say that domestically we're able to get it. And that doesn't work. Economically, it will just collapse in that sense. United States, for a long time, benefited out of this, that it allowed technology and talent to come in to be able to drive the innovation and creativity creation within the US. And today they have become the top global companies are actually US companies in the technology space. And behind that is a great contribution of the Indian talent and brain power. Let's not, there are no two things about it. There's a very well understood concept. Everybody knows this. Now, in the same sense, if United States today, that has become a sensitive matter because immigration, it's become a very sensitive because for a different reason. The domestic policies have not done the correction. So then you start villainizing the immigrants and taking away the jobs. That's a different debate altogether. But what happens is if you close the doors on talent, the talent will move elsewhere. So, in that sense, in my view, Canada will be beneficiary of that. Already, the largest Indian students that go anywhere in the world is actually Canada. There are 400,000 students who go there. Why? Because it's a very cosmopolitan, it's a very welcoming. They know that there's a value for the money, the hard work they make. They're able to prove themselves well and then able to get absorbed. So, in my view, Canada will be a big opportunity for driving technology in Canada, but it needs to be understood in today's 21st century AI. Because what happens in the AI, it is not so much about migration, because mode one under the GATS of the WTO is even more important. That is, you're staying within your country able to drive that kind of innovation. Now, we were traditionally under the impression that you need to have people going to those countries, but that will change. You need to have a balance. Eventually this technology will seek balance. You will need perhaps fewer people going to the location, the host country, and a large talent pool working from outside country. You have to understand these dynamics in the way the technology will drive this relationship. So mode one is important, and the mode one will drive mode three, because investment driven technologies and innovation, and then comes all of them drive mode four to the extent that is needed. But there's something else is happening in the West, the demographics. The demographic dividend is with India. There is a demographic deficit in the West, and Canada also is suffering from that. So it's a challenge for the policymakers. How do you balance it and how do you navigate it? And having to educate your own people of these dynamics is a challenge. But you have to constantly talk the narrative in a manner that is understood well and is also able to bring positivity in the relationship. So India is not for sending people all over the world, but I think we are only also saying legal migration should be opened to wherever that is possible. Look at the GCCs. India has become the most attractive place for the global capability centers. And that number is going to go from 1,700 to 2,600 by 2030 in a very short time. That's again, I say, technology chasing talent. So Canada has to understand the dynamic in this relationship. I think the CEPA should have a very comprehensive discussion around this subject. Thank you.
We are running out of time, so I'll ask you the final question, and a very broad question, so to speak. Since most countries are now looking at diversification, and especially Canada, since we are talking about them at the moment, India also wants strategic autonomy and therefore wants more trading partners, not to be dependent on a few. Under these circumstances, when countries are trading more with different partners, and there is no WTO arbitration structure that we knew for so long. The arbitration structure is almost collapsed because of lack of quorum. How do you see countries going forward, engaging with each other in trade? But when arbitration is required, what happens? I mean, is that a hurdle? And is WTO now done and dusted? Are we looking at another set of rules for countries to trade?
No, so there's again a very fantastic question, which is very thought-provoking in my view. So, Maha, let me approach it again from a broad to narrow, and what should be the future and the steps that we should take. So, today we are talking about strategic autonomy, multi-alignment, and what is this two big important words in the foreign policy of every country? Is every country will take actions as per their interest. It's very clear. My national interest will determine what I should do it. But to be able to do what I want, my national interest will dictate me. I need strategic autonomy. And to be able to express that strategic autonomy, implement it in action, you need multi alignment, you need more partners. That's very clear. So, and that's where again India and Canada stand together on that aspect. I think they are very, very clear in the way they drive the foreign policy, and the national interest should determine that foreign policy priorities. Now, what happens to multilateral trade rules? Today, we are saying that's like a spanner in the wheels of the multilateral trade rule book. So, why? Because, again, as I said, the GATT 1, Article 1 of the GATT, which is MFN, most favored nation status, that is now sabotaged. So it will take a long time to come back. That perhaps you have to renegotiate the entire WTO rulebook on that to be able to come back. But the more important than that, and even before the unilateral tariffs came and sabotaged the WTO rulebook, is actually the WTO arbitration dispute settlement mechanism that's collapsed, which used to be what is known as the jewel in the crown of the rulebook. But that has collapsed. So what do countries do when there are disputes or trade disputes between them? So normally arbitration was a normal thing, but today there is no arbitration. But to some extent, there is respect for rule book. People are still abiding by the rule book, even though in terms of the dispute, they may not be able to sort arbitration. Now, there is what is the concept called the state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism. So countries are beginning to have bilateral investment treaties in which they will have provisions that are able to settle. But that is also not enough, because what will happen is amongst the middle countries, emerging economies and developed countries will stitch their own trade deals, and they will be ambitious in the way they will offer to each other and become more freer. But then that is also leaving behind a significant part of the world, which is the global south. And that is where is my real concern is that we have to think that world as an organically linked entity would need to also worry about leaving behind the global south, and their inability to cope up on the trade is a very important aspect that we have to worry about. So India and Canada can, if they work together, and like again, as I said, the middle powers like European Union coming together, UK coming, Australia coming together, Japan, Korea, you start engaging on building the architecture of the WTO. Perhaps it requires new rules. We have to be flexible on that. But once you start doing it, it's very much sure that big countries will also join in, because we are so interdependent globally, we interconnected globally. So they cannot be left behind. So they will also join in some way or the other. So putting back the WTO rulebook is a very important agenda. And again, Canada and India can do it. If we are determined, we are focused, and we think for the world, peace and stability, and for the global south, we can do it together. Thank you.
On that fairly optimistic note, we'll wrap up this conversation. Many thanks, Ravi sir, for joining us here. It was a pleasure having you here on the USISPF platform, explaining what this India-Canada relationship can look like in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maha, for this opportunity. Pleasure indeed. Bye.
Yes, and I'd like to thank all the others who have joined us in this conversation. Thank you very much, and we'll continue with this webinar series in the future, the Canada-India Dialogue. Thank you, and bye-bye.